I was early. Again. Too early, as usual. The coffee shop smelled faintly of old pastries and wet pavement, and I sat at the corner table, one elbow resting on the worn wood, the other hand idly tapping a rhythm against the mug. My eyes kept flicking toward the door, though I knew she hadn't arrived yet. It wasn't like I hadn't been here before. I knew her order by heart: black coffee, no sugar, that tiny hint of cinnamon she'd asked for last winter. I remembered it because I'd come early enough to notice the way she held the cup, slightly tilted, fingers brushing the rim, the slight pause before her first sip. These little details, insignificant maybe, had become my quiet markers of time. "Right on time," she said when she finally walked in, a soft sigh escaping before she noticed me. I looked up, startled. She always had that effect, even in casual light. Mid-40s, composed, her jacket hanging just so on her shoulders, hair pulled back with an absent-minded twist. Her eyes met mine briefly, and for a moment, the world outside the glass window seemed to slow. "You're always early," she said, voice low enough to be half teasing, half observation. I shifted, folding the napkin in my hand a little tighter, my throat catching where it shouldn't. "I don't like keeping you waiting." She raised an eyebrow, as if she hadn't expected that answer. There was a pause. The kind that isn't uncomfortable, just loaded, as if a word had been dropped in midair and neither of us dared pick it up. I watched her settle into the seat across from me, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table, the way she always did when she was thinking about something else. I noticed it, of course. I always noticed. There was a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, subtle, private, and probably meaningless, but it lingered long enough for me to wonder. I stirred my coffee, pretending to be busy, but my eyes kept flicking back. She laughed quietly at something a barista muttered behind the counter, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Just for a second. There's a loneliness you can't explain. Not in texts or in conversations. Mine showed up in tiny ways, the half-written messages I never sent her, the paused thoughts I carried in my pockets, the way I always checked if her mug was empty before I dared speak. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't. I'm desperate. It was quiet, habitual, like a clock ticking in a room with no one else around. "You remember my order?" she said, almost to herself, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. I shrugged, trying for casual. "I notice things." Her eyes lingered on me, long enough that I felt exposed and oddly safe at the same time. There was a spark, maybe curiosity, maybe something heavier, that hung in the air between us. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words tangled in my chest. Instead, I just took a slow sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch. Then, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned slightly, and stood. "I have to go, but see you tomorrow?" I nodded, watching her coat shift on her shoulders, the same soft movement I'd memorized over months. She left a few coins on the table, and as the door clicked shut behind her, a small slip of paper fluttered from her pocket. I picked it up, careful not to let it crumple. It was a note, folded so precisely it felt deliberate. "Don't be late tomorrow." I stared at it, heart thudding, not out of fear, not exactly, but because suddenly, the quiet routine felt like the start of something I didn't know how to name. And somehow, I already couldn't wait to be early again. I showed up the next morning earlier than usual. The paper note from yesterday sat folded in my jacket pocket, warm against my side, like a secret I wasn't sure I deserved. The coffee shop was quieter now, sunlight pooling in lazy rectangles across the floor. She was already there, seated by the window, scrolling through her phone. "Morning," I said, trying for casual, though my throat felt tight. She glanced up, one corner of her mouth twitching. "You actually made it early. Impressive." I shrugged, pretending I hadn't rehearsed my arrival in my head the entire night. She laughed softly, and the sound seemed to echo just a little too long in my ears. "We ordered tea this time." She watched me fumble with the sugar packet, and I caught her eyes lingering longer than necessary. "I haven't done this in years," she said suddenly, nodding toward the small teacup in front of her. Sitting like this. Just waiting for someone. I froze, halfway between pouring milk and stirring. The words were quiet, but heavy, and for a second, I wondered if she knew how accurately she described me, the habit of waiting, the endless early arrivals, the empty texts I never sent. Why? I asked softly, more curious than anything. She shrugged, fingers tracing the rim. Divorce, I guess. You forget how it feels to notice someone, to share something that isn't work, isn't routine. Her gaze flicked toward mine for a heartbeat, and then away. There it was, the shadow over everything. I knew the risks. She was my boss's daughter. Not just older, not just divorced, but someone I could never openly say I wanted. Yet here we were, two people orbiting each other like a slow, invisible gravity. I imagined things I couldn't say out loud, laughing with her in the rain, sharing a book she'd love, holding her hand for just a second too long. The scenarios were quiet, invisible, and mostly unshared. We fell into a strange rhythm. I passed her the sugar jar without thinking. She adjusted my chair when it squeaked. Silence stretched comfortably between sips of tea. Tiny movements, her hair brushing her shoulder, my hand resting near the edge of the table, became louder than words. I used to come to this shop with my dad, she said after a pause. He'd order 2 teas, sit here, talk to anyone who would listen. I guess I'm trying to remember that ease. I nodded, not knowing if I should say something comforting or just let her words hang in the air. My thumb flicked nervously against the table, and I noticed her glance land there, subtle but aware. Then, just as I was about to leave, her hand brushed mine, accidentally, or maybe not. She smiled faintly, eyes meeting mine for a heartbeat too long. Careful, she said, dry, almost joking. I might start thinking you're deliberately clumsy. I laughed quietly, heart thudding. It was such a small gesture, a touch, a joke, a soft gaze, but it carried more weight than either of us admitted. I walked out afterward, feeling like I'd left something unsaid, something suspended in the air between us. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. The next day, I found her sitting at the same corner table, but this time she looked tense. Fingers drumming on her mug, eyes tracing the sunlight on the floor instead of meeting mine. I hesitated at the door, the bell jingling behind me, and for a moment I wondered if I should leave, pretend I was late, or not there at all. Hey, I said finally, voice low. She glanced up, smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Morning, she said. Almost clipped. We ordered tea again. I reached for the sugar jar, and she moved her hand just enough to intercept it. I've got it, she said softly. There was something deliberate in that motion, like she was trying to establish a boundary I hadn't crossed, yet. I nodded, but my fingers lingered near hers, brushing accidentally, or maybe I let it linger, before I withdrew. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses against your chest without a word. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words tangled. Instead, I watched the way her eyes softened for a moment when a barista brought a fresh pot of tea, the subtle shift in her shoulders, the flicker of unease when someone walked past the window. She stirred her tea, careful movements, and I noticed how her thumb traced the rim. Small gestures, tiny rhythms. I imagined putting my hand over hers, and then I stopped myself. Because I wasn't sure if she wanted that. If she wanted me. A friend walked in, waving from the other side of the shop. She stiffened, an almost imperceptible pull back, and I saw the invisible line she drew between her world and mine. I kept my hand on the table, inches from hers, just resting, pretending not to notice the small distance she insisted on. Busy day? I asked, voice too soft. Always, she said. Pause. You know, just. She trailed off, eyes flicking toward the window again. I nodded, thinking maybe she'd give me more if I stayed quiet. The quiet worked better than words anyway, more honest. Time stretched in little beats, the clink of spoons, the scraping of chairs, her soft exhale. I leaned in slightly, drawn to the warmth she radiated, to the familiarity of her hands brushing against the table, to the smile that nearly reached her eyes. She glanced at me, a small, fleeting look, and I felt the pull, the near impossibility of everything. My mouth opened, wanted to say something reckless, something true, but she shifted her chair back, just enough to make the space between us tangible. The mug rattled under her fingers, just slightly. Our eyes met again, and for a second I imagined leaning forward, bridging that tiny gap, letting everything fall into silence. She tilted her head, half questioning, half inviting, and I almost did. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I sipped my tea, letting the moment hang in the air like smoke. That near crossing, that brush against possibility, stayed between us, unspoken but louder than any words could have been. I walked out afterward, hands in my pockets, heart racing, and realized that she'd pulled back, but not completely. And that, somehow, made it more dangerous. More real. It was late afternoon when I found her on the park bench, the sun low, casting long, soft shadows across the pavement. I'd walked over without thinking, just needed to see if she was okay. "Hey," I said, voice low, careful. She didn't look up right away. Fingers twisting the strap of her bag, shoulders tense. Finally, her eyes met mine, and there it was, a flicker of something raw, maybe guilt, maybe fear, maybe both. "You're early," she murmured, almost accusing. "I know," I said. "I just thought I'd walk with you for a bit." We moved slowly, side by side, the space between us small but measured. I noticed the way she kept glancing at the path ahead, avoiding the easy pull of eye contact. My chest tightened, not in panic, but in that quiet ache you only notice when you care more than you should. "I saw him today," she said suddenly. My stomach nodded. "Who?" She paused, shoulders stiffening. "My son's friend, from work. He mentioned, you know." Her words trailed off, soft, like she was testing the air. I kept walking, trying to steady my pulse. Anne, I don't want this to be weird," she admitted, voice quieter now, almost swallowed by the breeze. "I don't want you to think I think you what?" I asked, and my voice broke just slightly. Her hand brushed against mine by accident. Or not. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers hover, close enough to feel the warmth, close enough to notice the small tremor. I like you," she said, voice catching in that soft, hesitant way that made my stomach turn over. Not loud, not dramatic, just that truth laid bare. I swallowed. My mind raced, imagined everything and nothing all at once. I wanted to lean in. I wanted to ask if she wanted me too. But words stuck, tangled, inadequate. Instead, I kept walking beside her, letting the silence stretch, letting the air hold all the confessions we couldn't fully speak. Her gaze flicked toward mine again, searching. "Do you?" Her question hovered between us, unfinished, fragile. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say yes, say everything. But I only nodded slightly, letting the nod carry what words couldn't. We stopped at a quiet corner, the park empty, sun dipping lower. Her fingers twitched near mine. My heart thudded in that long, familiar way, a rhythm of wanting and hesitation. For a moment, everything felt exposed, the space between us, the unsent words, the small gestures that had become louder than language. And then she stepped back, just slightly, as if testing the limit, testing herself. "I shouldn't," she said, voice soft, almost a whisper. I nodded again, understanding everything and nothing at once. The air felt heavy with what could happen, and yet, we remained, 2 steps from everything. I wanted to ask her, "Do you want me?" But instead, I just let the silence hold the question. I noticed it first on a Thursday. She didn't show up at the coffee shop. Not that I'd expected a text, she never texted, but the empty chair in the corner hit harder than I thought it would. I waited, stirring my coffee too slowly, watching the sunlight shift across the floor, and she didn't come. Friday came, same routine. I arrived early, hopeful out of habit, and the corner remained empty. I stared at the table she usually claimed, imagining her there, her fingers brushing the mug, her subtle smile, the way she leaned slightly toward me when we spoke. But the table was just a table. I didn't call. I didn't text. I wanted to, but a quiet voice in my head whispered, "She'll come back when she's ready." And so I waited, in that brittle sort of hope that feels like holding your breath underwater, unsure if you'll ever reach the surface. Then Tuesday. I passed her on the street, brief glimpse through the crowd. She didn't see me. She was with someone, her son, maybe, or a friend, and she laughed at something I couldn't hear. Something private, out of reach. I wanted to step forward. I wanted to say, "Hey. Are you okay? Did I do something?" But I didn't. Instead, I let the crowd swallow me, letting the half-smile I forced stay in place, my hands stuffed in my pockets like I belonged there. At night, I imagined scenarios, accidental meetings, missed texts, things I should have said, things I never would. Each scenario spun out, one after another, until the quiet ache in my chest became familiar, almost companionable. I remembered her confession on the park bench, the words caught between us, and suddenly it felt heavier, fragile in a new way. I realized there was baggage I hadn't seen, something she carried with her every step: divorce, her son, her past. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe I'd misread the warmth in her glance, the brush of her hand. I opened my phone, thumb hovering over her contact. I typed a message, "Are you okay?" Then deleted it. Tried again, "I miss our talks." Deleted again. Each time, the words felt too heavy, too presumptive, too dangerous. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused. Like life forgot to finish the sentence. The coffee shop saw me, day after day, sitting at my corner table, eyes wandering toward the empty seat across from me. I lingered over coffee, tea, sugar, sunlight, anything that might fill the silence she left behind. And somewhere I knew she was living her life, unaware of the small void she'd left in mine. A voice I couldn't hear, a step I couldn't follow, a chair I couldn't occupy. I left my phone on the table one evening, half hoping she'd call, half hoping she wouldn't. The screen glowed with silence, and I closed my eyes, tracing the rim of my cup, counting heartbeats, counting moments, counting the empty space she used to fill. I found her at the grocery store, leaning over the produce, the sunlight falling across her hair. She hadn't seen me yet. I paused in the aisle, hands gripping my basket like an anchor. The weeks apart had stretched in my chest, a quiet tension I carried everywhere. "Hey," I said, voice low, almost hesitant. She looked up, startled, then relaxed just slightly. "Oh," she said, glancing down at her basket, then back at me. "You came." I shrugged, awkwardly. "I figured I should check in. Make sure you're okay." She nodded, not meeting my eyes at first. There was a pause, long enough for the hum of the store to fill the space. She picked up an apple, rolled it in her hands, then set it back down. My gaze flicked to her fingers, noticing the small tremor, the way she hadn't expected me to see. I've missed this," I said finally, voice catching. "Not the store. Us. Talking. Even sitting together." Her shoulders shifted, uncertain, the weight of something unsaid pressing down. "I wasn't sure you wanted to see me," she admitted, quiet, careful. "After everything." I shook my head. "I did. I do. Even when it felt like you weren't ready." Her eyes lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the rawness there: fear, hesitation, maybe relief. She swallowed, fingers curling around the edge of her basket, and I wanted to bridge the space between us, wanted to lean in and let everything fall into silence. I shouldn't," she began, then paused. "You can't," I whispered. "Say it. Whatever it is." She exhaled, small, almost imperceptible. I didn't know if it was right. If I could let myself." Her voice trailed, and I understood. The stakes were heavy: age, expectations, past mistakes. But the tension wasn't in drama. It was in the quiet, in what might be lost if we misstepped. I reached across the basket, fingers brushing hers lightly. Not a grab. Not a demand. Just a touch. A tether. She looked down, then back at me, eyes softening. Okay, she said, voice small, almost a surrender. I nodded. Okay, I echoed. We stayed like that for a moment, the noise of the store fading, the world shrinking to the edge of our hands. No grand confessions, no cinematic gestures. Just acknowledgement. Connection. Quiet, human enough. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a solution. But it was something real. Something unspoken that finally didn't need words. And for now, that was enough. Weeks passed. We fell into a rhythm neither of us planned. The coffee shop still smelled faintly of old pastries, and I arrived at 8:47 a.m. like always, though now she often beat me there, black coffee in hand, eyes already scanning the window. We didn't announce anything. No declarations, no dramatic scenes. Just small acknowledgments, passing the sugar jar, sharing a laugh over a burnt scone, lingering over tea long after the cup was empty. The park bench became ours again, quiet afternoons with sunlight pooling across the boards. She traced the rim of her cup, I'd let my hand hover nearby, and sometimes, barely, our fingers would touch. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't flashy. It was enough. Life wasn't perfect. Some days she was distracted, other days I arrived too early, or she stayed later than I could. But the emptiness from before, the unsent texts, the paused thoughts, had softened. Presence replaced longing. One evening, as the shop's lights flickered on, she leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the window. You know, she said quietly, I didn't think it would ever feel this easy again. I smiled. Me either. No grand confession, no epic finale. Just that quiet understanding. That ease. The way the world could feel full without making noise. As I left that day, I glanced at the corner table, at the black coffee, at the small napkin she folded just so. It felt like home. Like patience, and small moments, and the ache of waiting, finally rewarded. And I thought, this is it. Not perfect. Not cinematic. But ours. Somewhere between early mornings and quiet benches, between touches that barely happened and smiles that lingered, we found a language only we understood. And for now, that was enough. Ch3